give it up for Collier.
We've all heard the story of that lucky individual who wins the lottery. Suddenly, they're a millionaire overnight. It's a pretty exciting story, and most likely we feel a little bit envious of this individual, right? We kind of wish we were them. But it's not unheard of to hear about this same individual a few years later has somehow managed to lose all of that money that they won. Now we're a little less envious. We might even be wondering how on earth they managed to do such a thing. If I were to win the lottery, I would never do that. Now, why am I talking about winning the lottery at a health conference? While losing all of your money seems like a crazy thing to happen, when we relate the same exact example to health instead, it suddenly becomes very common. How often have you heard about someone, or you know someone personally, or maybe you yourself have made tremendous health improvements, only to see 5 years later, 10 years later, those progress slip away and you're kind of back where you started? What both of these stories have in common is that we often spend a lot of time and energy and attention talking about how to exceed these first initial changes, how to win some of these successes, which is really important. It's part of the story. But often we stop there. We don't spend nearly as much time or attention talking about how to maintain them for the long term. How do we keep seeing those benefits 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Nobody taught that overnight millionaire some basic financial planning so that he could continue to multiply his money rather than squander it. But you all are here today already, starting to win that lottery for your health. You're already investing time, energy, money into attending conferences like this so that you can start to see those amazing health improvements. Hopefully, you've already implemented a ketogenic diet, and maybe you've already started to see some successes. Maybe you've already reversed your insulin resistance, or lost weight, improved brain energy, reduced brain fog. But as you're hopefully starting to realize, if we don't maintain those successes for the long term, then we've wasted a lot of time and energy today. And that is what I don't want you all to do. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to dig into why is this long-term success so challenging, and then we're going to talk about the 3M framework that I use with my patients so that we can actually see those long-term results stick around. The 3M framework talks about measuring the right things, being malleable in our approach, and then having the right mindset. But before we go too much further, let me officially introduce myself. As she mentioned, my name is Collier. I am a registered dietitian turned digital health startup co-founder. I'm originally from Indiana, but I live in Phoenix. And I used to work in kind of traditional healthcare setting, one-on-one with patients for many years. And for some obvious reasons, I eventually left traditional healthcare out of many frustrations with some of the walls I was hitting there, and I created my own health solution instead. And now my team at NutriSense and I have worked with thousands of people just like you all to help them both see those initial successes and maintain them. Because as a dietitian, my patient's journey often looked a lot like this: a roller coaster, yo-yo dieting. We would see success, we would keep making progress, we would hit a little bit of a plateau, which plateaus are normal, but then things would start to slip, and we would kind of wonder what was going on. How do we keep the momentum going? And it would be this roller coaster journey. If you have ever felt like this, I want to assure you that you are not alone. This is an extremely common and frustrating experience. And we have the statistics to back it up. You may have heard that 95% of diets fail. This just means that 95% of people who start a new nutrition plan don't stick to it for the long term. Similarly, 90% of people who lose weight regain that weight eventually. 90%. So these statistics make our success look pretty grim. 5 to 10% chance of keeping our weight off, maintaining our health journey. But fortunately for you all, I've done a lot of the hard work for you already. And through lots of trial and error, I have found that if you're just as intentional about that long-term success as that initial success, it's very easy to flip this statistic around. So my goal for you all today is to make you 95% successful and not the 95% failure. So it boils down to that 3M framework that I talked about. We're going to talk about measuring the right things, so being empirical. And then we're going to talk about being malleable or flexible in our approach. And then lastly, adopting a long-term mindset. 3 M's, easy to remember. So let's start with measurement. You may have heard that you can't manage what you don't measure. And this is true for all areas of our life. If we go back to our financial example, let's imagine that you didn't win the lottery, like most of us probably are not going to, unfortunately. So let's say instead you have a goal to have $5 million in the bank by the time of retirement. But let's say you still have 20 years between now and retirement. Right now, maybe you're in a good financial place, you're pretty satisfied with your progress, and that between now and the next 20 years, you're not gonna look at any of your bank account numbers. You're not gonna look at your portfolio. You're just gonna go off of kind of gut feel of if you're on track or not for the next 20 years. Because right now, things are good, so we're probably gonna be good. As you can probably imagine, that's not setting us up for success. That's going to decrease our odds of actually hitting that long-term goal. The same goes with health. We need to measure the right things, and we need to measure for life to know if we're on track or not. The common mistake that I often see is that individuals will measure a lot in the beginning. They'll track their weight, they'll track their ketones, they see a lot of progress, and then we kind of stop. And then years pass by, seasons pass by, and then slowly change starts to creep up on us. It's that story of the frog you put in boiling water, it's hot right away, but you put it in cold water and slowly turn up the temperature, and you don't notice the change that's happening around you. So instead, we have to measure consistently throughout our health journey. So what exactly do we measure? We can kind of break this down into 3 categories, thinking about our external health, our psychological health, and our internal health. When it comes to external, the most obvious example is our weight. And while weight is important, and I do recommend monitoring weight, I recommend paying the most attention to our body composition instead. Many of you have probably felt the common frustrations that happen when we pay attention to weight as the most important number. Our weight fluctuates a lot. Our fluid balance or our salt intake, our hormonal changes are all going to impact that number on the scale. And time after time, working with individuals, you feel like you're doing the right thing. You step on the scale, and you're 2 pounds heavier today than you were yesterday. And what tends to happen in that situation is people want to give up. They're over it. It's super frustrating. So while weight is still important, I recommend tracking body composition specifically over time. So there's a DEXA here this weekend. Maybe you all got to do it. That's a great way to monitor body composition. I have no affiliation with them, but I'm a huge fan of doing DEXA scans. And I recommend doing it at least once to twice a year. If you don't have access to that, just doing waist circumference or even taking a full body picture of yourself in the mirror can be a great way to monitor that progress. Next, we want to think about our psychological well-being. A lot of people gloss over this. We want to think about our labs, we want to think about our weight, but we don't talk a lot about our psychological health. So I recommend tracking this just as seriously as the other metrics as well. In particular, I recommend tracking energy levels and your mood. Because let's say your weight is going in the right direction, your body composition is looking good, but you're irritable, you're tired, you have no energy. That's a really important signal to pay attention to, and that's just as important as some of these other metrics. Similarly, let's say your energy levels are great, your weight is great, your labs are great, but you're miserable. You dread every meal. You hate what you're doing. That's also important. We want things to be enjoyable because that's going to set us up for that success long-term as well. You can track this in many different ways. People love to do just a good old-fashioned pen and paper. You can use the Note app in your phone, or there are designated apps for tracking this as well. The last section here is internal health. So you can think about this as kind of like your biometrics, your labs. And while there are tons of really interesting labs out there, it's going to depend a little bit on your unique health situation of what you might want to track over time. There are some basic labs I recommend everybody do, which is really just blood pressure, resting heart rate, a lipid panel, an inflammatory marker like hsCRP, and glucose. At a minimum, get some of those basic labs and basic metrics at least once a year. For things like blood pressure, resting heart rate, you might be able to even do that daily, of course. I wanted to talk today, though, about one metric in particular that I utilize with my patients that I have found to be a total game changer. So it's a specific way to measure glucose that not many people are doing, and it's called glycemic variability. So let me show you why I think this is so important. If you're measuring glucose, you may have measured either fasting glucose or your hemoglobin A1C, which is your average glucose level. So let's say you get those two labs drawn. Your fasting glucose comes back as 80 milligrams per deciliter, which would be considered excellent fasting glucose level. Very good condition. And then let's say you get an hemoglobin A1C, which can be an estimated average glucose value as well. And let's say that comes back at 95, which is equivalent to a 4.9% hemoglobin A1C. Also really, really good. Both of these look excellent. Now let's say we have two patients, patient A and patient B, and they have the same exact fasting glucose and the same exact average glucose. We might think they're both doing really well. But what I have seen over and over again is that if you put a continuous glucose monitor or a CGM on these individuals and you measure their glucose 24/7, you can capture what's called glycemic variability, which is those swings in your glucose, and often a different story emerges, something that looks maybe a little like this. We have patient A, who has a very stable glucose values, so low glycemic variability. You can see that they have similar average glucose and similar fasting levels, versus patient B has a much higher glycemic variability, those bigger swings throughout the day. Those swings could be caused by a lot of things, sometimes meals, but often stress or hormonal imbalance or disrupted sleep. And what ends up happening is that patient B is going to have much different outcomes than patient A. They're much more likely to have cravings and energy crashes with each of those swings. They're much more likely to have disrupted sleep, higher levels of inflammation, resistance to weight loss, and they're at an increased risk of chronic disease. So not just the obvious ones like diabetes, but also cardiovascular disease, hypertension, neurological conditions, and even some cancers. So I recommend, in addition to tracking annual labs that you can get anywhere, to wear a CGM at least once a year, in addition to the annual panel to see how you're doing. So in summary, we want to measure not just during our initial health changes, but we want to measure for life. And we want to look at internal metrics, psychological metrics, and external metrics. And that brings us to our second M, being malleable. So let's say, going back to our financial example, that you didn't win the lottery, but you have your retirement goal. You decided to start looking at your bank statements. You decided to start looking at your portfolio, and you start to see a change in your trends over time. Maybe originally the data was showing that you were doing very well, but you're starting to see a dip in your markets, your portfolios. And so it's not just a single number. We never want to look at an isolated number, but we're seeing trends over time of a negative downward trend. A fixed approach would say, let's do nothing. Let's do exactly what we were doing before because that seemed to work 5 years ago. Let's stay the course. Whereas a malleable approach adjusts to our new environment. It takes into these trends into account, and we adjust course a little bit. We adjust to the environment. Same exact thing with health. We need to adjust based off of the information we're seeing. So what does that look like in reality? That's looking at and understanding that there really is no one-size-fits-all, finding your personalized approach. It's understanding that our unique needs will change over time as well, and realizing that health isn't static. So digging into each of these, no one-size-fits-all. You've probably heard this time and time again, but my golden rule to nutrition, golden approach to finding what works for you is to first master the basics that everyone should be doing and then adjust from there based off of your personal, unique needs. So mastering the basics looks like eating whole foods, minimally processed items, nutrient density, reducing carbohydrate and sugar intake. So master those fundamentals, but then outside of that, there's a lot of variability. So let me show you one way in which this sometimes plays out. Looking at the CGM data again, this is actually my data. This first graph is an example of my data when I ate this small bowl of blueberries, so like half a cup of blueberries. And as you can see here with this arrow, that's my glucose response to blueberries. So even though it's a low glycemic fruit, I tend to just have high glucose response to blueberries for whatever reason. I actually have lower glucose response to bananas than blueberries. It's just a weird, unique thing about me. Whereas my colleague, who's the same gender as me, same age as me, same metabolic health as me, eats the same exact blueberries at the same exact time of day, and this is what her response looks like. Much more expected in line with glycemic index. And this is what we have seen over and over and over looking at real people's data, is that we're really different from each other. Even if you look like someone, you act like someone else, maybe even you're related to that person, the reality is that we have unique responses to food, not just in glucose, but across the board. So it's understanding that you might have a personal response. Maybe one way of doing things worked really well for someone else, but if you're looking at your numbers, your metrics, and it's not working as well for you, understanding that you might be different than that person. The second aspect here is understanding then that your needs might change over time. So that same exact approach that maybe worked for you today might not be the thing that's working for you 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There are some obvious examples of why our needs might change. Things like pregnancy, things like menopause, aging in general. All of these are going to adjust what might be best for us during that life cycle. And lastly, our health isn't static either. The process of getting healthier might also change what is best for us in that moment. As an example, I often work with type 2 diabetics. And one of the first strategies we'll do to try to get their glucose in good condition is to implement a ketogenic diet, reduce carbohydrate intake. And so often, if we're reducing carbohydrates, we're working out, we're adding lean body mass, we're addressing their sleep, their stress, eventually we can get their metabolic health in a really, really good place. We can reverse their diabetes. But likely, we're only going to maybe be able to have that many blueberries in the picture as your total carbohydrates in order to get glucose in a good place, in order to get ketones in a good place. It might be a very low carbohydrate threshold. Where let's fast forward 2 years from now, and that individual has lost a lot of weight, they've put on a lot of muscle mass, they've improved their sleep, and now suddenly we can probably triple the size of those blueberries and still maintain the same levels of glucose values and ketone values, because now their metabolic health is in a different place than it was before. So understanding that what's best for us in the moment depends also on our health at the time. So lastly, the third M that we really need to address is our mindset. So it's really shifting how you think about things to be long-term focused. We're not very good about that as humans in general, but we have to do it if we want that long-term result. So this looks like focusing progress over perfection and tapping into what is called intrinsic motivation. So a common thing that I see people do is to take an all or nothing approach. We're either 100% on or we're 100% off. We're either good or we're bad, black or white. We love to live in extremes. But instead of setting this idea of perfection all the time, because as much as we might want to be perfect, nobody is perfect. Instead of focusing on that perfection, I tend to shift people's mind to focus on progress and being consistent over time. So instead of focusing on being 100%, wanting that A+, let's focus on 80% instead. So it's not all or nothing, it's about consistency. So how does 80% play out? If we break this down into mealtime, most people tend to eat 3 meals a day, let's say. So let's say that's 21 meals in a week. 80% of 21 is 17. So you've got 17 meals to make them count. Dial those meals in. Make them exactly what you know nourishes you, drives your metrics in the right direction, makes you feel good. Dial those in. And then 20% remaining is 4 meals. And that's 4 meals where we've built in a little bit more flexibility. It doesn't mean that those 4 meals we go completely off the rails. It's just allowing ourselves to let real life happen every once in a while. Let's say you're traveling to a conference and you don't have access to your regular meals. You might have to alter it a little bit more. We're still kind of in line with what we know is the fundamental things to be doing, but we're giving ourselves a little bit of leeway. Maybe it's your mother-in-law's birthday over the weekend and they're celebrating, food is a little abnormal, and instead of feeling like a failure if you ate a little off, it's okay because it's part of the plan. That flexibility is built into your plan. This allows us to not go in those extremes of, oh, I messed up, so I might as well give up, and instead allow some of that flexibility. But alternatively, it also lets us not go too off the rails either. The traditional dietitian approach is everything in moderation, and I do not agree with that either. Because this is what I don't want you to be doing, is living for the weekend. That's the other extreme I see. That people eat really well during the week, and then they do whatever on the weekends. Where the weekends actually have more like 7 meals, which is about 33% of our meals, and that's way more than 20%. And that's not setting us up for success either. So it's not about being perfect. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be consistent. And then the second piece of that long-term mindset is intrinsic motivation. External motivation is the opposite of intrinsic motivation. And that's something like your doctor telling you, you really need to start exercising more. Or maybe it's your daughter's wedding coming up that you really want to lose 20 pounds for. External motivators are outside of ourselves, and they work really well for the short term and really poorly for the long term. That wedding or that short-term motivation to look good for bikini season doesn't help us when the going gets rough. Instead, we have to tap into what is called intrinsic motivation. We have to find our why for what we're doing this for, and we have to remind ourselves that over and over each day. And we also have to make the habits, our routines that we're doing each day, feel meaningful. It has to come from within. So again, another way I really like to build intrinsic motivation with people is by using wearables. As I've mentioned, I use the CGM as a wearable of preference, but any wearable works for this. Apple Watch, Fitbit, any type of data that's coming from your own body that can drive this feedback loop helps to build sticky habits. The reason for that is A, it's personalized. It's not this thing you read on a blog that tells you should go on walks after meals, and you're like, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. You did it for a week, and then you kind of forgot. Instead, it's seen in your data that when you go on a walk, your glucose levels improve, your resting heart rate improves, and you sleep better, you feel better, everything goes better. And now suddenly it's not a habit that you think you should do or maybe you should do. It's a habit that you've seen really works, and now you want to do it. And second, this creates this feedback loop, this instant gratification. Our brains love immediate gratification. This is why we love social media. We get the like on something, it's that immediate gratification that something was good. Same works with health, but unfortunately, most of the time with health, we have a very delayed time gratification. You might work out every day, but not see the benefit for a little while. Or maybe you eat that cookie and you didn't see the consequence for a little while. But with data, with that feedback loop, you get the immediate answer right away, and that helps our body to create those sticky habits that are going to stick around. So instead of wondering if this food is working well for me, you see in that moment that you respond well, and now you know it should be part of your routine. So then that becomes that loop of somebody's not telling you what to do, but you know what you want to do. So in summary, with that long-term mindset, we want to be consistently good, and we want to tap into that intrinsic motivation. So we all know good health is important. That's why we're here this weekend. And we know that we can't really have good health for the long term if we can't sustain it, right? And so I want you all today to be able to actually sustain the amazing progress you're already making. So if you implement the 3M framework, measure the right things and measure them for life, be malleable in your approach, be willing to be a little flexible, and then adopt that long-term mindset, then I promise you, you can be much more successful than that statistic that we opened with might have had you believe. So if you get anything from this presentation today, I just want you to know that you can continue to reap the benefits of your hard work today. You can be that person 40 years from now who's still thriving. Thank you.
Are you taking questions?
Yeah,
okay.
we take questions.
I love NutriSense and tried it myself just to experiment as a health coach. And I have a couple clients with type 2 diabetes prescribed another device, another CGM from another company, and it pales in comparison to the service and the functionality of your app. Few things that come to mind is assuming you can never pair your app with another device and charge for your dietitian support. Do you plan to offer any trainings for either other practitioners or for other clients or patients that just want to learn from your company?
Great questions. Yes, I have answers to both. So one, we can, if you bring your own device, you can do a cheaper plan that's just access to the app and our dietitian coaching. Right now, we're only compatible with the Freestyle Libre 14-day and then the Dexcom 6. We soon will be integrating with the newer Dexcoms and the newer Libres. So there is that option as well. And then secondly, yes, we are currently building a certification course for other healthcare professionals to take to learn how to interpret this glucose data specifically for non-diabetics, but also diabetics. Because when we started this company, there's no information out there. And now we've worked with thousands of people, learned a lot about how to interpret the data and how to help people along in this metabolic journey. So we are in the process of creating that course for other healthcare professionals. Yeah.
A couple of questions.
Sure.
One, if there's someone that has problems with sleeping at night, has the CGM helped resolve that?
It can. I can't promise that it's going to solve your sleep problem, but it's certainly there's a correlation between blood sugar and sleep. So it can be a missing puzzle piece for a lot of people. There's kind of a bi-directional relationship with sleep and glucose. So going into night of sleep with high glucose levels can cause us to not be able to get into those deep sleep stages, which can disrupt our sleep, of course. But then getting impaired sleep can cause higher glucose values the next day as well. So they're certainly very closely connected. And a lot of people kind of outside of the direct sleep connection have found that they get hypoglycemic at night, and that causes them to wake up, feel shaky, feel sweaty, have nightmares. So sometimes we can then pinpoint what might be dropping their glucose at night that's causing the disrupted sleep as well. Okay. But then there are many reasons that sleep, could be impaired. Yeah.
The other question is there a way do you see when, let's say, somebody does meditation and does meditation real well, can you see the results of that on a graph?
Yeah, absolutely. And like instantly, which again is really powerful, especially for our customers who are following a ketogenic diet. Sometimes their highest glucose responses in the day are from stressful moments because stress can skyrocket your glucose. And so then we'll work with them to implement some stress management techniques. For some people, meditation, others might prefer, breath work or different types of stress management. And then we can see that same glucose response just kind of come back down into normal ranges.
Okay.
So it's very powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question is, I wear the Freestyle Libre 2,
Okay.
and I noticed, especially when I change placements, that I get a huge variability in my numbers. And so is there any way I can fix that? Because it's frustrating.
Yeah. Do you use it through NutriSense or just through Libre
Through the
directly?
Yeah.
Yeah, so with the, I'll kind of take your question a little bit broader, but there is a general accuracy discrepancy. So what happens with the CGMs, both Libre and Dexcom, those are the two main manufacturers, is that the absolute number can sometimes vary between sensors. So let's say in a fasted state, at one sensor it might say 80, and the next sensor it might say 85 or 90. But then the trends in glucose are very precise. I don't know if that's been your experience as well, where the changes in the glucose values throughout the day tend to be very spot on. So what we allow in our app at NutriSense is the ability to directly calibrate and adjust that absolute value if you have a baseline from like a lab or a glucometer. I don't believe the Libre app directly, if you aren't using NutriSense, allows that, which I know is very frustrating, which is why we created that option. But it's just kind of knowing that baseline number, but paying most attention to the trends. So the changes in glucose should be very precise. So you can see that your glucose jumped 40 points, regardless if it started at 80 or 90. It's really about how it moves throughout the day that I'd recommend paying the most attention to.
Thank you.
Yeah.